This is the Everything 80s Podcast, episode 27. Who was Max Headroom?
Is this a private party or can any store crash?
So, new Coke is catching on. The taste is better and newer than. Oh, you said the P word.
So, what I want to know is, if you're drinking Coke, who's drinking Pepsi?
If you can't beat it, catch the wave. Coke, take it.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s Podcast. I'm Jamie. Today we're looking at kind of another iconic character, actor, sort of creation of the 80s. That's Max Headroom. So we're going to look at the whole history of him, how the character was developed, who played it, cultural impacts, like a ton of crazy stuff. That intro that you might have remembered was from one of the infamous new Coke commercials. And we'll get to all that in a bit. But before we start, if you haven't already, please make sure and subscribe wherever you find your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and pretty much everywhere. Okay, let's go. So if you grew up in the 80s, you absolutely know who Max Headroom is. In case you don't, you're either just going to have to Google him quickly, or if you've at least seen Back to the Future 2, you'll know him as one of the talking heads on the TVs in the Cafe 80s when they go into the future. But this is going to give you the whole lowdown, like just if you're looking to get a visual image of it. So the idea is the 80s were a period of many technological advances, and a TV character that would be Max Headroom would be created that would embrace that modern technology. So he was a fictional artificial intelligence character played by a real guy named Matt Frewer. He was considered the first computer-generated TV host, but the effect was created by makeup and prosthetics. There wasn't actually anything computer-generated about it. And again, he'd be used in TV shows, commercials, all sorts of stuff. Like I said, you might know him from the Cafe 80s. You probably remember him from the new Coke commercials. Not a lot of people saw that he had an actual show called the Max Headroom Show, and some shows in England. It goes pretty deep, but we'll get into all that because it's part like performance art, it's part ingenuity, it's a bit of absurdity. Matt Frewer, the way he played Max Headroom, and you heard a bit in that commercial from the intro, was a big, and you can probably sort of hear Jim Carrey in that, and that was a big influence on Jim Carrey, and so Matt Frewer was a real actual performance artist and actor, and they sort of brought this character to life. So the idea was, they were trying to capitalize on the advancements of technology in the 80s and make him become a true TV personality. And it's got, like, when you think of Max Headroom, it's not just that guy, it's actually a whole team that goes behind it. And they created this thing that's kind of part cartoon, part video game, a lot of story development. So like we're looking at the early, kind of iterations and what led to his development. And we live in an age, and it's kind of more prominent in the 80s, but we live in an age of a lot of mindless and moronic entertainment channels and personalities. I'm using that quote loosely, like on the E! Network and all that. Kind of like people that are a dime a dozen, if you ask me, like everyone trying to be the next Ryan Seacrest. They're all kind of insufferable, except for Mario Lopez. He gets a pass. And in the 80s, this is really when you have this big explosion of insincere and egotistical TV personalities. Like in the 70s and stuff, it seemed like more, real true journalism, which still always, existed. But in the 80s, you just get a little more of this new wave of this, kind of like Barbie doll, Ken cookie cutter looking, nothing of substance. And the idea was they wanted to develop Max Headroom into one of those personalities. So he would be created by a few people, not just Matt Frewer, but people including George Stone, Annabelle Jankel, and Rocky Morton. And they were the ones all sick of that sterile, one-dimensional, insincere, arrogant, like douchebag reporters that they'd see on every channel. The concept was put together, And the idea was to base Max Headroom partly on Ted Baxter, if you remember the Mary Tyler Moore show. That's kind of what they're going after. So they brought in, so like Matt Frewer didn't create this, he just played it. It's this team that created Max Headroom. They brought in Matt Frewer because he had a lot of improv ability, very witty, and he was really able to imply that sense of sort of self-importance and, you know, general, not a real term, but we call douchebaggery. And he was able to capture that. So here's the backstory on Max Headroom. They covered all their bases, and they wanted their computer creation to have a proper sort of history and mythology for TV, for a TV show, actually, that they would put together. And I think they had the idea that they could have a lot of spin-off opportunity into, like, I don't know, they were looking down the road, like potentially feature films or comic books or whatever. They just basically wanted to kind of give him that backstory, like, I don't know, like the way the Transformers did when they were introduced. It just can lead to so much other possibility. So the story with Max Headroom is that he comes from a dystopian future which is dominated by television and large corporations, kind of like sort of Blade Runner-ish, you know, picture something like that. The artificial intelligence used in Max Headroom is said to have come from a crusading journalist named Edison Carter. Carter is a hard-hitting reporter for Network 23 and tends to uncover things at the network that his superiors wish he hadn't. Eventually, he learns too much and he has to flee his work, which leads him to getting injured by a motorcycle, which puts him in a coma. Max Headroom is that computer reincarnation of Edison Carter, and the name comes from the last thing that Carter saw before getting hit in the parking lot, a sign that said Max Headroom 2.3 meters, which I think is awesome. So now they need to create the look of Max Headroom. And everyone, I always did too, I always thought that Max Headroom was an actual computer-generated image, but there's nothing animated, CGI-based, or at all. So they did the job very well. The look of Max Headroom involved a dark, shiny suit, which was actually made out of a fiberglass mold. He would wear Ray-Ban sunglasses and actually would be put in front of a computer-generated background, which was like inside this, it was really sort of analog. It was a slowly rotating wire cube. And since it was an analog creation, it would have to be controlled manually. So as much as they might have wanted to create a computer-generated image for all this technology, it actually just quite wasn't there yet in the mid-'80s. So even like those backgrounds, which are supposed to be computer generated, were actually hand drawn. And these hand drawn animation cells were created by Rod Lord, who would also create computer generated images for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So no computers are being used in these images. So the image of Max Headroom would be superimposed over these cell drawn backgrounds, and that helped to give everything a true, you know, computer-generated look. In future releases, they would use actual computer-generated images that were created by the Commodore Amiga. But like up until then, anything you saw was straight-up analog. To create more of the look of the Max Headroom kind of appearance, prosthetics would be used, and latex and foam makeup would be used to create that robotic look of his face. Max Headroom would only be shot from the shoulders up, so all the attention would be mainly on the head. It would take 4.5 hours to get all the makeup and prosthetics onto Matt Frewer, who said it was not fun and very grueling. He also compared the entire outfit and makeup to the feeling like he was on the inside of a giant tennis ball. So to create the voice of Max Headroom, that distinctive stuttering computer-generated voice, this is the only bit of technology they would use. And you know, he was speaking in this stuttery, glitchy type manner, and he had a distorted and electronically sampled voice that's what made people think he was a genuine robot. Like, people thought they were looking at an actual sort of sentient being. He had a chaotic speech pattern that would have his voice pitching up and down randomly. Sometimes he would just get stuck in like an electronic stuttering loop. You know, you can picture back to the Cafe 80s thing in Back to the Future 2. All these different modulations were achieved using what they call a harmonizer, and that they would also use one to recreate that effect in real life situations, like when he was in talk shows or whatever. So here's the first appearances of Max Headroom, which I'm positive people listening, well, depending where you're living, and if you're in North America, you probably didn't see, because he first appeared in England, of all places, in a British-made cyberpunk movie called Max Headroom 20 Minutes into the Future. And this was broadcast in 1985. You can check it the whole thing on YouTube if you want. It's pretty nuts. And I assume you're listening on some form of device. So if you go to just the show notes or the link for the show notes for the episode, there'll be a link to the whole article and then the YouTube thing there. But you can just look it up on YouTube depending where you are right now. So the TV movie was kind of hit, it's sort of cool. He would become his own star in England, and he would have his own show there for a bit. It was called the Max Headroom Show, and it was a video music program where he was just the VJ basically. So I partly grew up in England, between Canada and England, and so I was there at that time, and I have no recollection of this thing. And I'm thinking it was to try and be their own attempt at like an MTV style show, but England still had Top of the Pops, so I don't know what the approach was with that. Maybe just as an alternative choice. So they debuted him on Channel 4, but the show's an actual hit, and it's doubling the ratings of what was normally in its time slot. It ran for 3 seasons, and then they would start including like celebrity interviews, and they had a studio audience and stuff like that. So the second and the third seasons are actually shown in the U.S., over on Cinemax, and the Max Headroom Show would finish in England in 1986, but Cinemax would create a 4th season on its own, made up of 7 episodes. But those were never shown on British TV, so kind of weird where that whole thing was based and established. So it's kind of weird to see that this whole phenomenon, like, and again, if you grew up in the 80s, Max Headroom was a thing and it was big. But it's weird that it started in England. Like, I don't know, like a lot of things tend to do, and then they come over here. If you think of like the British invasions and the multiple, even if you think of like classic TV shows, they have English starts. Like everyone knows The Office was an English version at first. Even Three's Company was originally a British show. I can't remember what it was called. It was the same concept. And the Three's Company pilot is basically a shot-for-shot remake of this original British show. So we've been borrowing from England for a long time. But like I said, it was a big hit. It won a BAFTA award for graphics in 1986. They made a Christmas special. Like, it was a huge thing. So now there's the Max Headroom series. So the whole thing has jumped around between years and countries. And the Max Headroom series was shown in the U.S. and would last for 2 seasons in mid-1987 and late 1987. It was actually a spin-off from that original movie, and it was a real dramatic TV series, again, which seems weird. These were short series, and I vaguely remember them. I swear here in Canada they were on Sunday nights, and that would have been the only exposure I would have had to Max Headroom. I don't recall much of this show, but I remember it being obviously unique, different, kind of like sort of that like Knight Rider-y, dystopian, like that futuristic type thing. But again, I don't know who the target market was for Max Headroom. Was it teenagers? Was it adults? Was it for kids? Or like, I don't even know if they knew who they wanted to target. Like, I think, like I said, it was kind of a surprise. You don't go into anything hoping it's going to be a failure, but like with it being a surprise hit in England, I'm not sure what their intentional direction with the whole thing is. Even though it was short-lived, they put out a few more episodes of this show in 1988, and Max Headroom has been on the radar in the 80s, basically from 1985 onwards. So this leads to what we played at the start, and this is the infamous New Coke. Well, it's not that this commercial specifically is infamous, but the whole thing, everything to do with New Coke is pretty infamous. And you need to check. I did a whole other podcast episode on that, and one of the most interesting topics of the 80s. So here's a quick recap. Coca-Cola is losing traction in the market in the 80s, and Pepsi is breathing down their necks big time. So they decide to relaunch Coke, but with a whole new, sweeter flavor. Some say this was as a way to start introducing like high fructose corn syrup to make things cheaper. Some say it was to compete with the flavor of diet drinks, which were a little sweeter now, sweeter tasting because of the artificial sweeteners. But basically, they ended up changing it. It was testing pretty well, and people said they loved it as a kind of another option to Coke, and that was probably an important thing they should have paid attention to. So when they rolled it out, people hated it. There was such a backlash, and the thing was, like, it wasn't necessarily that they hated the taste of New Coke. It's just they took the original Coke away. All you could get now was New Coke. So people were flipping out. And if it was a separate product, it could have been fine, but it totally replaced normal Coke. So Coca-Cola was not banking on the nostalgia factor and taking away a beloved product. Basically within less than a year, no, actually way less than a year, like within months, they got rid of New Coke and they brought back regular Coke and they rebranded it as Coca-Cola Classic, which they kept the name up till around, I think, 2009. Some say this was their intention all along, to create a renewed interest in an old product, but who really knows? Anyway, one of the big commercial campaigns, and if you remember, the first one would star Bill Cosby, which, you know, is tough looking back on now, but at the time he was especially in the mid 80s, was the biggest star on TV. The Cosby Show was the #1 show for 4 straight years. Like, it was a behemoth. It was averaging like 30 something million people a show, which is incredible. So he was a big part of the marketing campaign. Also would be Max Headroom. So the idea with New Coke is they wanted to try to create a new hipper image, you know, so those young whippersnappers would be all over it. That was the thing with Pepsi. It was seen, you know, that whole choice of a new generation. Coca-Cola was seen as like an old person's drink, and Pepsi had this sort of new wave. New Coke was trying to do that, and they wanted to do it with Max Headroom. They wanted that new wave attitude and music and that sort of MTV approach and everything that was popular in 1985. And so, you know, they're looking at what's popular. That's what leads into Max Headroom. You know, music's popular, new wave music, MTV, video music, all that sort of thing. So that would be getting Max Headroom, they thought would be a way to kind of ride the coattails of all this new movement and capitalize on it. And he would promote the new wave attitude for New Coke with the slogan, which was "Catch the Wave," but done in his sort of stuttering voice. And I think if you can go back and look at all these ads, I think they were more effective and a lot better. As much as like Bill Cosby was considered like America's dad and all that sort of thing, I think the Max Headroom ones did capture that tone and that spirit they were looking for. It's funny that Bill Cosby actually complained about New Coke possibly derailing his career because of the monumental failure of New Coke, which is, we'll just leave that where it is. Okay, so this leads to what is called, sort of dubbed, the Max Headroom incident. So this one is bizarre. So just disclaimer alert here, and you can look this whole thing up on YouTube. So on November 22nd, 1987, 2 different TV stations in Chicago had their signal interrupted by an unknown person who was wearing a Max Headroom mask. The first hijacking took place 25 seconds into a sports highlight broadcast on WGN TV Channel 9 in Chicago. 2 hours later, another station hijacking happened at 11 p.m. on a PBS affiliate that was airing an episode of Doctor Who, and the intrusion lasted for around 90 seconds. So through the different hijackings, the person in the Max Headroom mask and sunglasses went on some pretty bizarre rant, shall we say. He actually goes all about the whole thing, like an involvement with New Coke. He talked about an old TV series from the 60s called Clutch Cargo, and he ripped on WGN sports anchor Chuck Swirsky. There was a homemade Max Headroom background that was being rocked around as the hacker spoke, and he talked in this like distorted voice. It was basically a piece of corrugated metal, and they used to try to, you know, they were trying to recreate the Max Headroom background. The second hijacking, or hacking, whatever you want to call it, ends with the person's pants pulled down, bare-assed, where he gets spanked with a fly swatter by someone in a French maid's outfit. And again, I won't share more of the other details. You can look up this whole story or the YouTube videos, but you can't make this stuff up. So WTTW had their transmitter on top of the Sears Tower, which is, what's that now, the Willis Tower, I think. And they're trying to cut the signal. Like, this is 90 seconds. That's a lifetime on TV, but they couldn't because they didn't have any engineers on duty. They basically had to watch helplessly until the video hijacking ended. They never discovered who did the hacking, but there's different theories that it was a disgruntled former employee of WGN, which I might lean towards. So if you imagine if that happened today, it would be easily captured. The whole thing would be recorded and whatever, but so not a lot of people either got to see this thing but at least it made the news rounds and it was pretty significant. Again, if you can probably see more of the full stories on news reports on YouTube, just look up the Max Headroom incident. Okay, so let's start wrapping her up right here. I'm sure everyone is aware of Max Headroom in the 80s. I was very aware, but I didn't realize how deep all of this went, especially with the backstory. And maybe you don't either, like with the movie in England and the TV show and all this sort of history they created and the whole like music video show in England and then going back and forth between the countries. So it's a pretty deep thing. They were playing around with an actual movie called Max Headroom for President, but it ended up being canceled. Hard to say. I think that would have been a relatively decent hit. I don't know if it would have fallen in sort of that like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure sort of like demographic. I'm not sure. I think it would have been decent. But Max Headroom has lived on and remains a significant, albeit weird, part of the 80s. And you could see him in Back to the Future 2 as well. He was featured in Ready Player One in the book. If you remember, Wade's sort of computer assistant thing he had was set up as Max Headroom. So that was cool. I don't think they had anything in the movie in Ready Player One. I should know this because I've seen it so many times. I think I would recall. I think that was specifically just to the book. Honestly, I think the whole concept could work well again if it's reintroduced into movie form or some other format, whether it's like a Netflix series. I think it could work because of obviously what they could do with the CGI and technology. But then again, since like I knew Max Headroom so well in the 80s, I had no idea of the backstory about him. So I think it would be tough because people would be watching wouldn't be familiar. Like a brand new audience would have no idea, but then maybe they would embrace it and would learn it. But like the rest of us have nothing to look back on. We only know him more from like the new Coke commercials or Back to the Future Part 2 or whatever. So the concept I think could work, but who knows? So I'm just throwing that out there. Okay, so I'll finish it up here. Thanks for listening. Hope you like this episode. If you like it, again, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcast. If you really like it, hook me up with a rating and review. That helps out the show. More people get to see it. Okay, thanks for listening. See you later.